At first glance, the dynamic between Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith appears rigidly defined. Rick exists as a multiversal constant of intellect, a figure who bends physics, societies, and timelines to his will. Morty, by contrast, enters the story as an anxious, hesitant adolescent, whose primary function seems to be obedience and survival. The imbalance is so extreme that the idea of Rick fearing Morty appears absurd. Yet across the series, Rick's behavior repeatedly contradicts the assumption that Morty is insignificant. His actions reveal a pattern not of casual disregard, but of deliberate containment. When examined carefully, this pattern suggests that Rick is not afraid of who Morty is, but of who Morty is becoming. Fear, in Rick's case, does not resemble panic or submission. His personality is shaped by omniscience, loss, and an extreme form of nihilism. Traditional fear would imply vulnerability, something Rick refuses to acknowledge. Instead, his fear manifests through control, preemption, and psychological limitation. Rick does not flee from Morty. He stays close, intervenes constantly, and reshapes Morty's internal landscape whenever growth threatens the existing hierarchy. This distinction is critical, because Rick's intelligence allows him to identify future risks long before they materialize. Morty represents one such possibility. Throughout the series, Morty repeatedly demonstrates traits that challenge Rick's worldview. He shows empathy where Rick shows detachment. He hesitates when Rick acts decisively. He experiences guilt, attachment, and moral conflict even after prolonged exposure to cosmic absurdity. Rather than eliminating these traits through experience, the universe Rick forces Morty through often strengthens them. This outcome directly contradicts Rick's philosophy that exposure to meaninglessness eventually erodes emotional investment. Morty does not become numb, he becomes discerning. Rick's response to this development is rarely overt confrontation. Instead, he employs consistent psychological erosion. Morty's successes are reframed as mistakes. His bravery is dismissed as ignorance. His ethical resistance is mocked as weakness. Over time, this discouragement serves a specific purpose. Confidence is the foundation of autonomy. By destabilizing Morty's self-perception, Rick delays the moment Morty might act independently without hesitation. This behavior stands out precisely because Rick does not apply it universally. He acknowledges intelligence in adversaries, rivals, and even alternate versions of himself. He reacts with competitiveness or respect when faced with equals. Morty alone is denied validation, even when circumstances justify it. Such selective behavior implies recognition rather than obliviousness. Rick sees something in Morty that must be kept unfinished. The most explicit demonstration of this fear appears through Rick's manipulation of memory. Canon establishes that Rick routinely erases Morty's recollections, but the significance lies in what is removed. The erased moments are not limited to trauma. They include instances where Morty asserts independence, recognizes Rick's moral failings, or achieves clarity about his own identity. These memories represent psychological milestones. By eliminating them, Rick interrupts Morty's developmental trajectory. Memory is not simply recollection. It is the architecture of selfhood. A person's sense of capability, agency, and morality depends on accumulated experience. By repeatedly resetting Morty's internal progress, Rick ensures that growth remains fragmented. Morty learns lessons but cannot integrate them. This creates a cycle where Morty continuously approaches self-realization without ever fully arriving. Such behavior only makes sense if Rick perceives Morty's maturation as dangerous. If Morty were truly disposable, Erasing memories would be unnecessary. Replacement would suffice. Instead, Rick preserves Morty's presence while constraining his evolution. This indicates that Morty is not interchangeable in the way Rick pretends. The existence of evil Morty provides canonical confirmation that Rick's fear is not hypothetical. Evil Morty does not defeat Rick through brute force or superior intellect alone. He succeeds by understanding Rick's psychology and exploiting systemic arrogance. He recognizes patterns Rick refuses to confront, including the way Ricks collectively underestimate Mortis. Evil Morty is the logical endpoint of unchecked Morty development. He embodies strategic patience, emotional detachment, and long-term planning, traits Rick associates with himself. Importantly, evil Morty does not represent an anomaly created by external corruption. He emerges from the same conditions imposed on countless Mortis. His success demonstrates that Morty's limitations are not inherent, but enforced. Rick's fear is validated by the existence of a Morty who escaped control and dismantled an entire structure designed to contain him. Rick's reaction to evil Morty further reinforces this interpretation. Rather than dismissing him as irrelevant, Rick treats him as a fundamental disruption. The central finite curve itself exists to isolate realities where Rick remains dominant. Mortis are not merely collateral within the system. They are variables requiring containment. The curve ensures that no intelligence surpasses Rick's, but it also limits the environments in which Mortis can evolve freely. This systemic restriction mirrors Rick's personal treatment of his own Morty. Rick's emotional responses offer additional insight. Whenever Morty asserts independence, Rick reacts disproportionately. These moments often trigger recklessness, self-destruction, or abandonment tactics. Rick does not respond with calm detachment, which would be consistent with true indifference. Instead, his reactions resemble insecurity. He spirals when Morty's loyalty wavers. He becomes erratic when Morty chooses others over him. These responses suggest that Rick's sense of control is tied directly to Morty's dependence. This dependence is not merely emotional. Morty functions as a grounding force that anchors Rick to a specific identity. Without Morty, Rick confronts the full weight of his own nihilism. Morty provides friction against Rick's belief that nothing matters. As long as Morty remains uncertain, Rick can maintain his worldview without challenge. A fully realized Morty would force Rick to confront the possibility that meaning persists even in infinite universes. Rick's insistence on keeping Morty physically close further supports this interpretation. He rarely allows Morty extended independence without supervision. When separation occurs, Rick intervenes quickly or sabotages the situation. Surveillance replaces trust. This behavior aligns more closely with threat management than mentorship. Rick monitors Morty, not to protect him, but to ensure predictability. Canon also establishes that Rick has access to countless Mortis, yet he consistently returns to this one. Even after abandoning universes, replacing families, or resetting timelines, Rick maintains a bond with Morty that exceeds convenience. This persistence contradicts the narrative of disposability. Morty is not easily replaced because the specific psychological relationship matters. Rick knows this Morty's weaknesses, doubts, and triggers. Control is easier when familiarity exists. Morty's moral resistance plays a crucial role in this dynamic. Unlike Rick, Morty experiences guilt as a stabilizing force rather than a burden. He struggles with the consequences of violence and exploitation, even after repeated exposure. This moral persistence represents an existential threat to Rick's philosophy. If Morty can endure infinite chaos without abandoning empathy, Rick's justification for nihilism collapses. Rick's fear, therefore, is existential rather than physical. Morty represents proof that intelligence does not require detachment, that survival does not demand cruelty, and that meaning can persist without illusion. A Morty who fully integrates these traits would surpass Rick not in power, but in resolution. Rick cannot tolerate this outcome because it invalidates the narrative he constructed to survive his own trauma. The ultimate irony lies in Rick's attempts to prevent this future. Every act of control, every erasure, every insult contributes to the very conditions that create someone like evil Morty. Suppression breeds awareness. Manipulation teaches strategy. Dismissal sharpens perception. Rick's fear causes him to shape Morty into the threat he seeks to avoid. Rick is not afraid of Morty as he exists now. He is afraid of a future where Morty no longer needs him, no longer fears him, and no longer accepts the premise that nothing matters. In that future, Rick is no longer the smartest person in the room, not because someone exceeds his intellect, but because someone rejects his conclusions. Morty's greatest danger to Rick is not intelligence, violence, or rebellion. It is the possibility of growth without surrender. Rick recognizes this possibility long before Morty does. That recognition shapes every interaction between them. What appears as cruelty is strategy. What appears as indifference is vigilance. Rick does not keep Morty close because Morty is weak. He keeps him close because one day Morty might not be. And when that day comes, Rick knows that no amount of genius will be enough to undo it. This fear also explains Rick's inconsistent application of mercy toward Morty. On multiple occasions, Rick exposes Morty to experiences that would psychologically devastate an average person, including planetary destruction, mass death, and personal responsibility for irreversible consequences. At first, this appears contradictory. Why traumatize someone you wish to keep weak? The answer lies in Rick's worldview. He believes repeated exposure to horror should result in emotional erosion. In Rick's mind, suffering is a solvent. It dissolves attachment, morality, and hope. By subjecting Morty to extreme situations, Rick attempts to accelerate a transformation toward emotional numbness. However, this strategy repeatedly fails. Morty does not emerge hollow. He emerges conflicted. Instead of abandoning empathy, he begins questioning authority, especially Rick's. This outcome is visible after major canonical events involving irreversible loss. Morty carries guilt forward, while Rick compartmentalizes or erases. Each time Morty retains emotional memory, Rick's philosophy weakens. Rather than accepting this failure, Rick doubles down, increasing exposure while simultaneously removing memory when the result becomes inconvenient. This contradiction reveals desperation rather than confidence. Rick's fear becomes even more apparent when considering how he reacts to Morty, making independent moral decisions. When Morty attempts to assert ethical boundaries, Rick does not engage philosophically. He avoids debate. He either sabotages the situation, reframes the outcome, or invalidates Morty's reasoning entirely. For someone who prides himself on intellectual dominance, this avoidance is telling. Rick debates systems, ideologies, and even cosmic entities, but he avoids confronting Morty's moral consistency. That consistency threatens Rick's justification for his own choices. Canon also establishes that Rick understands probability and long-term outcomes better than nearly anyone. His fear is therefore predictive, not reactive. He sees trajectories rather than moments. Morty's trajectory, when unimpeded, leads toward autonomy paired with retained empathy. This combination is rare within Rick's multiversal experience. Most intelligent beings either succumb to nihilism or seek domination. Morty seeks understanding while resisting dehumanization. This makes him unpredictable, and unpredictability is the one variable Rick cannot fully control. The central finite curve reinforces this interpretation further. While its stated purpose is to isolate realities where Rick remains the dominant intellect, its unintended consequence is the systematic suppression of environments that allow divergent growth. Mortis within the curve are raised under conditions of perpetual belittlement, exposure, and disposability. These conditions are not accidental. They ensure Mortis remain reactive rather than strategic. Evil. Morty's escape from the curve represents not just physical liberation, but developmental freedom. Once removed from Rick-defined constraints, Morty's potential actualizes rapidly. Rick's reaction to this escape is notably restrained compared to his usual responses to existential threats. He does not chase endlessly, rebuild the curve immediately, or launch multiversal retaliation. Instead, he appears resigned. This resignation suggests recognition rather than defeat. Rick understands that once Morty leaves the system entirely, control is no longer possible. Fear shifts into acceptance. The threat he anticipated has simply arrived sooner than expected. Another critical detail lies in Rick's selective honesty. Rick frequently admits his own flaws in abstract terms, yet he avoids acknowledging them directly to Morty. He frames himself as honest, but only on his own terms. When Morty approaches truths that undermine Rick's authority, Rick intervenes. This behavior mirrors that of individuals who fear losing narrative control. Rick's identity depends on being the final interpreter of reality. A Morty, capable of independent interpretation, destabilizes that role. Rick's reliance on Morty for practical reasons further complicates the relationship. Morty serves as camouflage, emotional grounding, and moral contrast. Rick benefits from Morty's presence in ways he rarely admits. Yet, dependence creates vulnerability. The more Rick relies on Morty to anchor his existence, the more dangerous Morty's independence becomes. Rick cannot afford to acknowledge this dependency, so he masks it through disdain. Even Rick's moments of apparent sacrifice reinforce the argument. When Rick chooses Morty's survival over his own advantage, it is not purely altruistic. It is preservation of a future he still believes he can shape. Rick does not want Morty gone. He wants Morty unfinished, alive, present, uncertain, and emotionally fragmented. This state allows Rick to maintain relevance. Morty's gradual increase in competence throughout the series directly correlates with Rick's escalating control mechanisms. Early seasons rely on insults and exposure. Later seasons introduce memory alteration, technological dependency, and structural manipulation. As Morty becomes harder to influence through shame alone, Rick resorts to systemic solutions. This escalation mirrors threat assessment models rather than mentorship models. Canon consistently shows that Rick fears systems he cannot dismantle from within. Governments, citadels, and collective intelligences provoke disproportionate responses. Morty represents a similar system in embryonic form. A conscience paired with experience creates resilience. Rick recognizes this pattern because he has dismantled it elsewhere. Morty is dangerous precisely because he has not been corrupted enough to abandon it. The tragedy of this relationship lies in its inevitability. Rick's fear ensures the outcome he dreads. By denying Morty the space to grow naturally, Rick forces growth through resistance. Each act of suppression teaches Morty something Rick never intended: patience, observation, strategy, silence, evil. Morty did not emerge from rebellion alone. He emerged from watching Rick's repeat the same mistake endlessly. Rick's intelligence allows him to understand this on some level, which makes his behavior more tragic rather than less. He is aware that control accelerates divergence, yet he cannot stop. Letting Morty grow freely would require Rick to relinquish superiority, not in intellect, but in meaning. That surrender is something Rick is fundamentally incapable of. In the end, Rick's fear of Morty is not rooted in the possibility of being overpowered. It is rooted in the possibility of being rendered obsolete. Morty does not need to defeat Rick to surpass him. He only needs to live well without accepting Rick's conclusions. That outcome would prove that Rick's suffering was not inevitable, only chosen. Rick understands this truth before anyone else. That understanding shapes every calculated insult, every erased memory, every intervention disguised as indifference. Morty is not Rick's weakness because he is fragile. He is Rick's weakness because he represents an alternative. Rick stays close to Morty, not out of love, and not out of necessity, but out of vigilance. He watches not because Morty is harmless, but because the moment Morty stops doubting himself, Rick's worldview collapses. And that collapse is the only thing Rick has ever truly been afraid of. Rick's fear also clarifies why he consistently reframes Morty's moments of clarity as mistakes rather than lessons. Whenever Morty reaches a conclusion that challenges Rick's assumptions, Rick intervenes not by disproving the conclusion, but by invalidating the process that led to it. He attributes Morty's insight to emotional weakness, chemical imbalance, or situational distortion. This tactic preserves Rick's intellectual authority without engaging the substance of Morty's reasoning. For someone who prides himself on rational superiority, refusing to argue on the merits reveals insecurity. Rick does not fear being wrong in general. He fears being wrong in front of Morty. Canon repeatedly shows that Morty is capable of synthesizing experience into coherent judgment. Unlike Rick, who compartmentalizes endlessly, Morty integrates. He carries consequences forward. Each loss reshapes his decision-making. This accumulation creates a form of wisdom distinct from intelligence. Rick understands knowledge as dominance over systems. Morty develops understanding of people, including Rick himself. That awareness gradually strips Rick of mystique. The more Morty sees Rick clearly, the less effective Rick's intimidation becomes. This erosion of mystique is one of Rick's greatest vulnerabilities. Rick's authority depends not only on capability, but on perception. As long as others view him as incomprehensible, his power remains unquestioned. Morty's proximity grants him insight into Rick's habits, contradictions, and emotional tells. Over time, Morty learns that Rick's cruelty often masks avoidance, that his bravado conceals grief, and that his detachment is not strength, but insulation. A Morty who understands this no longer fears Rick, and fear is the primary lever Rick uses to maintain control. Rick's fear of Morty is therefore inseparable, from his fear of being understood. Most beings encounter Rick briefly, chaotically, and at a distance. Morty experiences him continuously, in mundane moments as well as cosmic crises. This sustained exposure humanizes Rick in ways Rick cannot tolerate. It reveals limitations that Rick works tirelessly to deny. Morty becomes a witness to Rick's humanity, and that witness cannot be erased without consequences. The canonical choice to keep Morty biologically and emotionally young also reinforces this interpretation. Despite access to technology capable of accelerating development, enhancing cognition, or stabilizing trauma, Rick allows Morty to mature naturally. This is not benevolence. Artificial enhancement would produce a Morty capable of immediate independence. Natural growth is slower and easier to steer. Rick prefers gradual risk over sudden loss of control. Time becomes a containment tool. Even Rick's reliance on alcohol plays a role in this dynamic. Intoxication blunts Rick's foresight, allowing him to avoid confronting long-term implications. Morty, by contrast, remains sober within Rick's chaos. This asymmetry matters. Morty remembers patterns Rick chooses to ignore. Over time, Morty becomes the archivist of Rick's behavior. He remembers the costs Rick refuses to track. This imbalance threatens Rick's narrative authority, because narratives collapse when evidence accumulates. Rick's occasional attempts at emotional openness do not contradict this fear. They reinforce it. These moments often occur when Rick senses Morty pulling away. Vulnerability becomes a tool of reattachment. Rick reveals just enough pain to reestablish emotional leverage without relinquishing control. This selective honesty maintains dependency while preventing genuine equality. Rick fears a Morty who can empathize without submitting. Canon also shows that Rick's fear intensifies when Morty interacts meaningfully with alternatives to Rick. Other authority figures, peers, or environments that offer validation destabilize Rick's influence. Rick reacts to these situations with sabotage, mockery, or forced escalation. He cannot tolerate frameworks where Morty's worth is not defined by Rick's approval. This behavior aligns with monopolization rather than care. Morty's increasing competence further amplifies this tension. As Morty becomes more capable, Rick's dismissiveness grows sharper. The insults become more frequent, more cutting, and more absolute. This escalation mirrors patterns observed when control begins to slip. Rick senses the narrowing window during which Morty's self-doubt can be maintained. Each successful mission, each independent choice, each refusal chips away at the psychological scaffolding Rick constructed. The tragedy is that Rick is not wrong about Morty's potential. Canon validates Rick's fear repeatedly. Morty's intelligence, adaptability, and moral resilience make him uniquely positioned to surpass Rick in ways Rick cannot counter, not through domination, but through coherence. Morty is capable of building a life Rick cannot dismiss as meaningless. That possibility terrifies Rick more than death, because it reframes his entire existence as avoidable suffering rather than cosmic inevitability. Rick's ultimate limitation is not lack of foresight, but lack of courage. He cannot risk being proven unnecessary. Morty represents a future where survival does not require abandonment of empathy. That future exposes Rick's choices as defensive rather than inevitable. Rick would rather be feared than be irrelevant. Morty threatens both outcomes by growing quietly, persistently, and observantly. In the end, Rick's fear of Morty is not a flaw in his character. it is its logical conclusion. A man who defines himself by superiority cannot coexist peacefully with someone who demonstrates an alternative path. Morty does not need to defeat Rick, escape him, or even oppose him openly. He only needs to continue becoming himself. Rick understands this long before Morty does. That understanding governs every calculated cruelty, every erased memory, every dismissive laugh. Rick stays ahead of Morty, not because he is confident, but because he is afraid of falling behind in the one arena where intelligence offers no defense, meaning. And Morty, whether Rick admits it or not, is building it one experience at a time. This growing meaning is precisely what Rick has spent his entire existence trying to outrun. Canon makes it clear that Rick's defining trauma is not loss alone, but the conclusion he drew from it. He interpreted suffering as proof that attachment is a mistake, and that significance is an illusion generated by limited perspective. Morty's continued capacity to care directly contradicts that conclusion. Every time Morty forms an attachment and survives its consequences, Rick's philosophy weakens. Morty becomes living evidence that Rick's emotional retreat was a choice, not an inevitability. Rick's fear intensifies because Morty does not challenge him loudly or ideologically. Morty rarely frames his resistance as a philosophical argument. Instead, he simply behaves differently. He hesitates, he questions, he refuses to detach completely. This quiet divergence is far more dangerous than open rebellion. Ideologies can be debated or destroyed. Lived examples cannot. Morty's existence undermines Rick without confrontation, and Rick has no effective defense against that. This explains why Rick often engineers situations that force Morty to compromise his values. By placing Morty in scenarios where every option carries moral cost, Rick attempts to demonstrate that ethical consistency is impossible. If Morty can be made to act cruelly, even under duress, Rick can point to that outcome as validation of his worldview. However, Morty's reactions to these situations rarely align with Rick's expectations. Instead of rationalizing his actions, Morty internalizes responsibility. He does not excuse himself by appealing to the nature of the universe. He accepts guilt. Guilt is something Rick cannot tolerate, not because it is painful, but because it implies accountability. Rick rejects accountability as a meaningless construct in an infinite multiverse. Morty's guilt insists otherwise. It suggests that actions matter regardless of scale. This belief is incompatible with Rick's survival strategy. As long as Morty continues to feel responsible, Rick's detachment remains unjustified. Rick's attempts to normalize apathy therefore function as indoctrination. He frames emotional disengagement as intelligence, cynicism as maturity, and care as naivete. Morty's resistance to this framing is subtle but persistent. Over time, Morty learns that Rick's dismissiveness is not proof of correctness, but a shield against vulnerability. This realization diminishes Rick's authority more effectively than defiance ever could. Canon further supports this interpretation through Rick's relationship with other Mortys. Across the multiverse, Mortys are treated as tools, shields, and camouflage. Their individuality is systematically erased. This is not coincidence. It is policy. The collective behavior of Ricks demonstrates an institutional fear of Morty autonomy. Individual Ricks may rationalize this behavior differently, but the pattern remains consistent. Mortys must remain confused, insecure, and dependent for the system to function. Evil. Morty's success exposes this system as fragile. He does not overthrow it through chaos, but through clarity. He understands the structure better than those who built it. That understanding comes from observation, not superiority. He watches Ricks behave predictably, arrogantly, and dismissively. He learns their blind spots. This method mirrors Morty's canonical development. Patience replaces impulsivity. Insight replaces fear. Rick's response to this exposure is revealing. He does not attempt to rebuild the same structure immediately. He does not deny what happened. Instead, he retreats inward. This withdrawal suggests recognition that the old methods are no longer sufficient. Once a Morty has seen the system clearly, it cannot be unseen. Control loses effectiveness once awareness emerges. Rick's fear is therefore temporal. He fears the moment Morty's awareness becomes irreversible. Memory erasure delays this moment, but cannot prevent it entirely. Experience accumulates even when specific details are removed. Patterns remain. Emotional residue persists. Morty grows not because Rick allows it, but because growth is a natural consequence of sustained exposure to reality. The irony is that Rick could prevent this outcome by trusting Morty. Genuine mentorship would produce loyalty rather than resistance. Equality would foster collaboration rather than divergence. However, trust requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires acceptance of uncertainty. Rick's entire identity is constructed around avoiding uncertainty through control. Morty threatens that structure simply by existing within it. Rick's fear also explains his oscillation between cruelty and protection. When Morty appears close to breaking away, Rick becomes protective, even sacrificial. When Morty appears compliant, Rick becomes dismissive and harsh. These shifts are not random. They are corrective measures. Rick adjusts pressure to maintain equilibrium, much like an engineer stabilizing an unstable system. Morty is not treated as a person, but as a variable. Yet variables change. Morty's emotional resilience increases with each cycle. What once destabilized him becomes manageable. What once terrified him becomes familiar. Rick underestimates this adaptation repeatedly, because acknowledging it would require admitting that Morty is no longer static. That admission would collapse the illusion of control. By the later stages of the series, Morty's fear of Rick is visibly diminished. He still hesitates, but he no longer freezes. He questions openly. He disobeys when necessary. These changes provoke less overt punishment and more manipulation, suggesting that Rick recognizes punishment as ineffective. Fear no longer works as reliably. Respect is not offered because respect would validate Morty's autonomy. Rick is left with fewer options. The ultimate tragedy is that Rick's fear prevents the only outcome that could save him. A Morty who grows freely could choose to stay. A Morty who feels respected could forgive. A Morty who understands Rick fully might even help him confront his trauma. But a Morty who is controlled will eventually seek escape. Rick knows this. He has seen it happen across universes. Yet he cannot act differently, because doing so would require surrendering the very defense mechanisms that allowed him to survive his loss. Rick is trapped by his own intelligence. He can predict the outcome, but cannot emotionally tolerate the steps required to change it. Morty, meanwhile, continues forward, not because he is fearless, but because he has learned that fear does not disappear through avoidance. It fades through action and understanding. Rick's fear of Morty is therefore not a weakness to be mocked. It is the clearest evidence that Rick recognizes Morty's humanity as something powerful. In a universe where intelligence reigns supreme, humanity becomes the ultimate disruption. Morty embodies that disruption quietly, persistently, and inevitably. Rick watches this happen in real time. He intervenes, delays, redirects, and suppresses. But growth continues regardless. One day, Morty will no longer need Rick to define the universe for him. On that day, Rick will be forced to confront the possibility that meaning was never an illusion, only a risk. That risk is the one thing Rick has never been willing to take. And that is why, beneath every calculated insult and every act of control, Rick Sanchez is afraid of Morty Smith. Rick's fear becomes most visible when considering how he handles endings. Rick avoids closure whenever possible. He resets timelines, abandons universes, and reframes conclusions as irrelevant. Endings imply consequences, and consequences imply meaning. Morty, however, is deeply affected by endings. He remembers worlds left behind, lives disrupted, and versions of himself that no longer exist. Even when details are erased, the emotional weight lingers. Morty carries unfinished business internally, while Rick externalizes it through abandonment. This difference matters. Someone who carries endings forward eventually seeks coherence. Someone who avoids them seeks distraction. Rick understands where each path leads. Canon repeatedly shows that Morty's suffering does not desensitize him in the way Rick expects. Instead, it refines his judgment. Morty becomes better at recognizing manipulation, better at predicting outcomes, and better at distinguishing cruelty from necessity. These skills develop not despite Rick's behavior, but because of it. Morty learns to read Rick the same way Rick reads systems. Observation becomes Morty's survival mechanism. Over time, that observation matures into understanding. Understanding is dangerous to Rick because it cannot be intimidated away. Power loses effectiveness when motives are transparent. Morty's growing ability to anticipate Rick's actions reduces Rick's leverage. This is why Rick increasingly relies on structure rather than improvisation as the series progresses. He builds safeguards, protocols, and contingencies. These measures are not signs of confidence. They are signs of adaptation to a variable that no longer behaves predictably. Rick's fear also explains why he avoids clearly defining Morty's role. Morty is alternately framed as burden, shield, apprentice, liability, and family. This ambiguity prevents Morty from anchoring his identity. A defined role would allow Morty to measure growth against a standard. Ambiguity keeps Morty uncertain, and uncertainty sustains dependence. Rick benefits from this confusion, but it also reveals intent. Roles are withheld when growth is undesirable. Despite this, Morty continues to assemble an identity from fragments. He draws conclusions from repeated patterns rather than explicit instruction. He learns what Rick values by watching what Rick protects, what Rick destroys, and what Rick avoids confronting. Morty notices that Rick fears being replaced, fears being irrelevant, and fears being emotionally exposed. These realizations slowly invert the power dynamic. Fear shifts direction. Morty begins to understand Rick more clearly than Rick understands Morty. Rick senses this shift. His dismissiveness becomes sharper, but also less convincing. The cruelty becomes performative rather than corrective. This suggests Rick is no longer trying to shape Morty, but to reassure himself. When insults fail to land, Rick escalates to spectacle. When spectacle fails, he retreats. These oscillations indicate instability. Control is no longer assured. The canon trajectory points toward an unavoidable divergence. Morty's growth is no longer hypothetical. It is observable. He acts decisively when necessary, resists manipulation with increasing confidence, and accepts responsibility without collapsing under it. These traits are incompatible with the role Rick assigned him. Morty is becoming something Rick did not plan for and cannot fully suppress. Rick's fear is ultimately self-directed. Morty forces Rick to confront the possibility that intelligence without empathy is not superiority, but limitation. Rick understands systems, but Morty understands people. Rick predicts outcomes, but Morty learns from them. Rick escapes meaning, but Morty builds it. These differences create an asymmetry Rick cannot solve with technology. The tragedy is not that Rick fears Morty. The tragedy is that Rick understands exactly why he should. He sees the pattern clearly. He knows where it leads, yet he lacks the emotional capacity to alter course. Admitting Morty's potential would require admitting his own failure to choose differently when he still could. That admission would dismantle the narrative that has sustained him across infinite worlds. So Rick clings to control. He insults, erases, distracts, and intervenes. Not because Morty is weak, but because Morty is strong in a way Rick never learned to be. Morty's strength is not dominance or detachment. It is endurance without surrender. In the end, Rick's fear is not about being surpassed. It is about being exposed. Morty represents a future where suffering does not justify cruelty, where intelligence does not require nihilism, and where meaning survives even in an infinite multiverse. That future renders Rick's choices optional rather than inevitable. Rick can destroy worlds. He can rewrite physics. He can outthink gods. But he cannot erase the quiet truth Morty embodies. That truth grows with every experience Rick fails to invalidate completely. Rick stays close to Morty because distance would allow growth to accelerate unchecked. He watches because he knows exactly what is happening. He delays because delay is all he has left. Rick is not afraid of Morty as a threat. He's afraid of Morty as proof. And proof, unlike people, cannot be controlled forever. What ultimately makes Morty terrifying to Rick is that Morty does not need to win. Rick's entire life is structured around victory, survival, and dominance over systems. His intelligence is optimized for overcoming obstacles, not for coexisting with contradictions. Morty introduces a contradiction Rick cannot defeat. Morty demonstrates that it is possible to move through the same chaos, witness the same horror, and still arrive at a different conclusion. That divergence does not announce itself as rebellion. It simply exists. Rick cannot outthink it because it is not an argument. It is a lived outcome. Rick's fear is sharpened by the fact that Morty's growth is irreversible in ways Rick's resets are not. Timelines can be abandoned, memories can be altered, and universes can be replaced, but patterns of perception persist. Morty learns how Rick behaves under stress, how he rationalizes cruelty, how he avoids responsibility. Even when specific events disappear, Morty's intuition improves. He becomes harder to deceive, harder to intimidate, harder to reshape. Rick senses this accumulating resistance, even if he refuses to name it. This is why Rick increasingly frames Morty's independence as a liability rather than a success. Independence implies self-direction. Self-direction implies values. Values imply judgment. Rick can tolerate judgment from enemies because enemies are external. Judgment from Morty is internal. It originates from someone who knows Rick intimately, someone whose opinion Rick cannot fully dismiss without dismantling the last human connection he maintains. That proximity makes Morty uniquely dangerous. Canon shows that Rick's rare moments of self-reflection often follow situations where Morty acts without him and survives. These moments destabilize Rick's self-concept. If Morty can navigate reality without Rick's guidance, then Rick is not essential. Rick's genius becomes optional rather than necessary. For someone who has defined himself by indispensability, this realization is catastrophic. Rick's fear is therefore not about loss of control alone. It is about loss of purpose. His identity depends on being the smartest, the most capable, the one who sees through illusions. Morty threatens this by embodying a different kind of clarity. Morty does not deny the chaos of the universe. He accepts it and still chooses connection. That choice reframes Rick's detachment as avoidance rather than enlightenment. Rick's intelligence allows him to recognize this truth even as he resists it. That internal conflict explains his volatility. He oscillates between protecting Morty and sabotaging him, between closeness and cruelty. He wants Morty near because Morty anchors him to something real, yet he fears what that reality implies. Rick is caught between needing Morty and needing to remain right. The canon trajectory suggests that Rick's strategies are becoming less effective. Morty no longer internalizes every insult. He questions more openly. He resists more consistently. Fear no longer defines their dynamic as completely as it once did. Rick adapts, but adaptation is not the same as control. Each adjustment reveals the limits of Rick's influence. What makes this inevitable is that Morty's growth does not rely on Rick's approval. It relies on experience. Rick can delay, distort, and distract, but he cannot stop time. Morty accumulates perspective simply by continuing to exist within the chaos Rick creates. Every attempt to suppress meaning paradoxically generates more of it. Rick understands this outcome better than anyone. He has seen versions of it play out across realities. He knows that systems built on control eventually collapse when the controlled become self-aware. His fear is not speculative. It is informed by experience. Morty is not the first Morty with potential. He is simply the one Rick cannot discard without consequence. In the end, Rick's fear of Morty is the clearest evidence that Morty matters. Rick does not fear insignificance. He fears relevance he cannot dominate. Morty represents a future where intelligence is no longer the highest currency, where empathy is not a weakness, and where survival does not require abandonment of self. Rick Sanchez, the man who claims nothing matters, behaves as if one thing does: Morty Smith. Not as a suicide weapon, not as a tool, not as a threat in the traditional sense, but as a living refutation of everything Rick believes he had to become. That is the fear Rick can never fully escape. Rick's fear endures because it is unresolved. There is no decisive moment where Morty overcomes Rick, no singular confrontation that resolves the imbalance. Instead, the tension persists quietly, embedded in routine interactions and unspoken recognition. Rick continues to act as though Morty is replaceable, yet his behavior betrays that claim. He recalibrates around Morty, adapts to Morty's reactions, and anticipates Morty's decisions with increasing care. These are not the actions of someone unconcerned. They are the actions of someone tracking a variable that matters. What Rick cannot accept is that Morty's growth does not require opposition. Morty is not becoming stronger in order to challenge Rick. He is becoming clearer in order to live. That distinction renders Rick's defenses ineffective. Control works against rebellion. It fails against self-actualization. Morty does not need to confront Rick directly to surpass him in the one domain Rick cannot dominate: coherence between belief and action. Rick's fear is amplified by the fact that Morty never fully rejects him. Morty continues to care, even as he becomes more independent. This continued attachment prevents Rick from dismissing Morty as an enemy. An enemy could be destroyed, avoided, or ignored. Morty remains present, observant, and emotionally engaged. This forces Rick into an ongoing confrontation with his own contradictions. Morty's presence becomes a mirror Rick cannot shatter without consequence. Canon suggests that Rick is aware of this mirror. His rare moments of silence, restraint, or hesitation often occur after Morty demonstrates unexpected resolve. In those moments, Rick does not lecture or mock. He withdraws. Withdrawal is significant. It indicates recognition without resolution. Rick understands the implication, but lacks the tools to address it honestly. Rick's fear is therefore not a plot device or hidden weakness to be exploited. It is a structural feature of his character. A person who believes nothing matters must suppress evidence to the contrary. Morty is that evidence. Morty survives trauma without abandoning empathy. He adapts without surrendering identity. He learns without needing dominance. Each of these outcomes contradicts Rick's core assumptions. This contradiction explains why Rick never fully commits to destroying Morty's individuality, despite having the means. Complete erasure would eliminate the threat, but it would also eliminate the proof Rick secretly needs to remain near. Morty represents both danger and hope. Rick cannot acknowledge the hope without dismantling his worldview, yet he cannot remove it without confirming his own emptiness. This paradox traps Rick in perpetual control rather than resolution. Morty's eventual independence, should it fully manifest, will not arrive as triumph. It will arrive as quiet separation. A moment where Morty no longer looks to Rick for permission, validation, or explanation. That moment will not require confrontation. It will simply be evident. Rick fears that inevitability because it offers no opportunity for reversal. There is no machine that can undo self-understanding. Rick Sanchez understands this better than anyone else. His intelligence allows him to see the end long before it arrives. His tragedy is that foresight does not grant escape. He continues forward, managing, suppressing, delaying, fully aware that delay is not prevention. Morty does not need to become evil Morty to validate Rick's fear. He only needs to become whole. that outcome would not destroy Rick's universe. It would simply reveal that Rick's suffering was not the only possible response to it. And for a man who built his identity on the necessity of his own detachment, that revelation is the most terrifying thing imaginable.